Africa constitutes 28% of the total membership of the United Nations and is rich in resources that the rest of the world is eager to get their hands on. Yet Africa is the only region in the world without a permanent representation in the United Nations Security Council. The Security Council is the highest and most powerful body in the United Nations and is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. It's even more ironic that Africa has no permanent representation on the Council and plays no key role in the organization, but yet Africa is central to the organization's work. In 2018, for example, more than 50% of UN Security Council meetings, 60% of its official documents, and 70% of resolutions contained in Chapter 7 mandates all largely focused on Africa. This imbalance in its structure and the injustice to Africa has prompted calls from African leaders about the need for Africa to have a permanent seat in the Council. The president of Burkina Faso, Captain Traore, has also joined the growing voice of African leaders to correct this injustice. Will there be any changes? Let's find out. When the United Nations was founded in October 1945, only 4 African countries were part of this organization. Today, all 54 countries are member states of the UN. Now, of the 193 member states, only China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America are the only permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. This gives them more veto powers than the rest of all UN member states when it comes to decision-making in the Council, including the entire African. Although Africa is represented on the UNSC by the so-called A3, a bloc of 3 elected African states on UNSC, these countries have no big say since none has veto power as opposed to the other 5 states with permanent membership. With the unity of African states through their body, African Union, AU, the role of Africa in global affairs cannot be underestimated. The question then is, why has Africa been left out of the UN Security Council? To answer this, we have to go to the beginning. The root of Africa's marginalization at the United Nations can be traced to the many injustices endured by the continent over the past 500 years. Over 4 centuries, the European slave trade trafficked about 12 to 15 million people across the Atlantic to produce sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton for the global capitalist economy. As stated by the African scholar Adekeye Adebayo, the West's industrialization was thus literally built on the back of African slavery. For Africa, the slave trade brought about devastating and irrevocable consequences in the form of depopulation, increased warfare to enslave more people, mass migration, and ecological damage that exacerbated diseases and food insecurity. But it didn't end here. This sad history evolved to the Berlin Conference in 1884, where European leaders divided the African continent amongst themselves. They drew borders, split some ethnic groups, and gathered others together, not minding the consequences of putting people with different traditions and beliefs together. This division further led to the imposition of colonial states that divided communities and operated on a logic of extraction and oppression of their populations. This continues to be felt in the unmanageable governance systems on the continent that are often incompatible with democracy and the rule of law. The Berlin Conference also laid the foundations for the neocolonialism that continues to define Africa's economic relations with the rich nations. According to reports, Africa loses an estimated $203 billion a year through illicit financial flows, profits by multinational corporations, and ecological destruction. Now, fast forward to 1945, when world leaders gathered to establish the United Nations after the Cold War. Of the 51 original member states, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and the Union of South Africa. The truth of the matter is that the Security Council was designed to reflect the winners of the Cold War, and because those world leaders didn't regard the African continent as anything, Africa was not given any seat on the council. The annoying thing is that these people gather together to make decisions regarding Africa without the input of Africa. But do you know what's even more interesting? It's the fact that since the United Nations was established decades ago, Africa has not been a mere recipient of the UN's largesse, but an active contributor to its success. Western media might portray the continent as a basket case of backward societies that are always receiving aid, rather than as agents of progress. But the fact is that Africa has given more than it has received. The continent has contributed and still continues to contribute significantly to the UN, especially in peacekeeping missions around the world. Over the past 60 years, Africans have contributed personnel to UN peacekeeping missions around the world. For example, countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Ghana are among the top 10 contributing countries of troops to UN peacekeeping operations. African countries also took up the cause of independence for Namibia in the International Court of Justice. They have also taken leadership in the UN, including 2 secretaries general. The African Union and African regional actors oversee 10 peace operations. African peace missions have upheld important UN norms by challenging unconstitutional changes of government. So, given Africa's significant contributions to UN peacekeeping operations and its status as the largest regional group of UN members, it becomes obvious that the continent needs to be fully represented as a permanent member of the UNSC. This is why African leaders, including Captain Traore, have demanded that Africa be granted at least 2 permanent seats in the United Nations Security Council. During the 2019 UN General Assembly, which also marked 75 years of the UN's existence, almost one after the other, several African leaders repeated their calls asking for Africa to be granted permanent seats on the UN's Security Council. South Africa's president, who was also the president of the African Union, Cyril Ramaphosa, noted that, "We repeat our call for greater representation of African countries on the Security Council, and that this be taken up with urgency at intergovernmental negotiations." The same message was also voiced by several other African leaders, including Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo, who stressed that to fit the 21st century challenges, UNSC must be reformed to allow African countries representation with a permanent seat. Now, why is a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council important for Africa? As we stated earlier, the UNSC has been making decisions that directly or indirectly affect Africa, but without meaningful input from African states. In many ways, issues of the African continent with its 54 countries, which are members of UN, have not received much attention from UNSC when compared, for example, with peace in Middle East and other non-African countries like North Korea. For example, files of UN peacekeeping operations that involve African states show less involvement of Africa and at best are never contentious during the Council's deliberations, as often decisions are taken by the UNSC permanent members without Africa's input. Another example of this is how the members of the AES Confederation sent a letter to the UN regarding Ukraine's involvement in the attack that killed Malian and Wagner soldiers. Yet, the UN has not deemed it worthy to table the issue and discuss how it can be dealt with. Even when Mali sent a letter to the UN regarding France's involvement in orchestrating the Tuareg rebels to cause destruction and instability in the country, the UN still did not respond or react. But it shouldn't be surprising given that France has a permanent seat on the Council and Ukraine is an ally of the West. Also, a closer analysis shows how African issues such as Central African Republic and Libyan crisis attracted intense discussions at Security Council. The Libyan crisis in particular saw some UNSC permanent members taking sides with Russia and France, backing warlord General Khalifa Haftar's forces against Libya's UN reorganized government in Tripoli. Other UNSC permanent member states such as USA and China have also been accused of backing their allies involved in this crisis, largely due to selfish strategic interests. All this shows a clear indication how selfish and strategic interests influence some UNSC members, states with permanent positions on the Council, while making important decisions that affect African countries' interests. So, as other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council push their agendas, Africa's agenda is usually ignored. This is the reason why Africa needs to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Africa's experience of the UN system over the past 80 years has been one of misrepresentation and underrepresentation, and the fact is that just like other global institutions such as the World Bank and IMF, the UN Security Council needs a reform. In fact, it is long overdue, and a reform is even beneficial to the UN because it will ensure its legitimacy in an uncertain future of new and evolving security threats. These include the climate crisis, novel pandemics, and new technologies like artificial intelligence. Right now, the UN no longer has credibility because of its imbalanced structure and its failure to solve major conflicts in the past decade. Now, the UN will turn 100 by 2045, and at that point, Africa will have 2.3 billion people, making up 25% of the global population. Young Africans will be the world's workforce and consumer base, fueling the global economy. The question is, will the membership of the Security Council still look like it does today? What do you think? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.